Hello, I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene. The scene is set. Someone carefully picks up a beautiful snake. The shiny, smooth scales glimmer in the sunlight as they examine every inch of this stunning animal. Most people in the pet trade have seen this species before, prized for its fantastic variability of color morphs. Many people would hold this beautiful albino animal as a shining jewel in their personal collections. Someone, however, has just pulled this animal from under a log outside. Typically, an experience coveted by many, the discovery of an aberrant snake living in the wild. This time, however, the animal is placed in a container with 5 other nearly identical individuals collected from the same area that day, and the quest continues to remove these unique invaders from islands without a single native snake. And what's up, nerds?
Hello, everybody.
We are finally doing an episode about herps.
Woo!
I've been ready for this my whole life.
Snakes.
Oh man, I'm super excited. So I'm assuming most people follow us on Instagram, but if you don't, I am fond of snakes. Just a little bit.
I like it a lot.
And
I thought you were going to say I am offended, but that also...
I am, if you follow us on Instagram, I am offended. No, actually, if you don't follow us on Instagram, I am offended. But people have been asking, when are we going to do a snake episode? What, and every time I put up, what episode do you think we're going to do next? Like most people guess something with snakes or reptiles or something like that. We're getting there. I am trying to suppress my natural tendencies, and it's very difficult, but hey, we're getting there in a really, really cool one that unfortunately has been brought to somewhat recent attention. I've known about it for a very long time, and I've been sitting on it for a while because I wanted to keep it kind of under wraps. But then when I saw that people were starting to share the information and things like that, especially for Invasive Species Week, I was like, we need to jump on this because it's going to be overdone if we don't get into it. So perhaps some of you know about this topic. Perhaps some of you know a little bit of information about it. But I have tried to source pretty much as much information regarding this topic as possible because it's super interesting to me, and I think it's going to be interesting to anyone. So just as a quick aside, as we always have, I thought that this episode was going to be kind of short, and it's longer than the milkweed episode. At least my show notes are. So I'm going to try and get through it as quickly as possible. That was my bad. Sometimes I just get really carried away when I'm doing my scripts for these episodes. And yeah, so it's only slightly longer, and I think that I'm going to breeze through it a little bit more quickly. So hopefully this isn't too long of an episode, but again, I'm going to be as thorough as possible. And we're going to also have the opportunity to discuss a couple things within the pet trade. And we're omitting a Devil's Advocate episode or segment. And I will kind of explain why when we get to it. But there isn't one for this thing. I don't even know if you guys like it. You should probably tell us in the comments below if that's something that you enjoy and we should keep doing for future episodes where it's applicable. But, you know.
Right. We did have one person reach out to us and say that they liked kind of adding that element where we were sort of bringing in questions that would be from the public in a way and then debating them. But it would be really nice to hear some more feedback for sure. For this episode, I am the one who is blissfully ignorant, so I don't know a lot about this stuff. So it's going to be really interesting for me. This is kind of the flip side of the getting antsy episode for us, I guess. And I will try to keep Nicholas reined in on time a little bit. No, I'm just kidding. Everybody loves
we'll cut
listening
it
to
short
you.
if we have to, but so I should probably just say what we're talking about. I'm sure a lot of the herpetologically oriented people are just biting at the bits right or chopping at the bits right now, listening for me to just say what this is about. And I'm currently doing my best to draw it out as long as possible to make it even worse for them.
Well, we're waiting.
But we're talking about invasive king snakes. Not only are we talking about invasive king snakes, Kirsten, But we are also talking about invasive albino king snakes and other morphs.
Strictly
So
just albino. Oh, and other morphs. Okay. All right.
yeah, so like there are, I'll explain it a little bit more, but
Okay.
essentially in the Gran Canaria island, there is an invasive population of introduced pet trade animals that, because there are no native predators and no native snakes, they have established, even though a lot of the introduced populations are albino. And I think I do break it down at some point into percentages somewhere, but most of the population is aberrant in some way, meaning that they have a different color or pattern from like a native specimen, which would naturally camouflage that or prevent camouflage in their native habitat, and they would probably get eaten by a predator almost immediately. But in this case, since there are no natural predators, they've established this is something that is pretty unprecedented. Now, obviously, we have populations of invasive reptiles all over the world. We'll get to Florida eventually, I promise. But we don't have a lot of invasive species that are albino or, any sort of morph like that, where their invasiveness is actually able to overcome a natural hindrance to their survivability, which is insane to me. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, these are the California king snakes, which is Lampropeltis gutula californiae, or sometimes just Lampropeltis californiae. Um, so it may be a subspecies of Lampropeltis gutula, but I didn't necessarily find any concrete information one way or the other. I'm sure there will be somebody who will be able to tell us, what it is specifically. But regardless, it's a California king snake, and it is either a subspecies or its own separate species. So I like breaking down etymology for a lot of things, and Lampropeltis just means brilliant or brilliant. I just mixed two words, brilliant or radiant shields. And obviously, California means that they're from Oklahoma. No, I'm just kidding. It means from California is essentially where they were described.
Okay.
So within their native range, they're doing okay. There is habitat loss that is caused by development, as well as rock collection that has caused declines in populations, but they are listed as least concerned under the IUCN. There are some subspecies and related species that are critically endangered, like the California mountain king snake, but the California king snake itself is actually doing okay, with, of course, probably cited as a population declining because of the aforementioned anthropocentric interferences. Where is it from? Well, this may shock you, and I'm sure you're on the edge of your seats, but the California king snake's predominant range is in California.
Wow.
We pride ourselves on bringing you the most novel and interesting information. Tell your friends. The typical habitat that fits these snakes is, well, kind of all of them. So you've got woodland chaparral, grassland, deserts, marshes, and there are many instances in which these snakes are present in suburban areas due to development occupying one or more of these previously mentioned habitats. Although these snakes are primarily found in California, such as their name suggests, these snakes can also be found in Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, southwestern Colorado, northwestern New Mexico, and northwestern Mexico. So they have a pretty extensive range. California, the epithet is probably because that's where they were described, or that's where they have like a predominant presence.
Okay, confirming that's their native range.
Yes, that is their native range.
Okay. So yeah, they're super generalists then. You can find them across many states and in essentially any habitat that you can find in those states.
Yep. Yeah. A wide variety, which makes them, as a standard, pretty adaptable and probably pretty tolerant, which makes them a good setup for an invasive species, as we will soon learn. So where is it currently invasive? So I mentioned before that it is currently invasive in Gran Canaria Island. Specifically, we'll be looking at Valesquillo and Galdar populations, as these show the most morphological differences, and that's also primarily where the main studies that I looked at for this research were. So Gran Canaria, for reference, is one of Spain's Canary Islands off of northwestern Africa. So that's where we're looking at, which is by far and away completely impossible for this species to reach even from like a floating piece of, there's no snakes on this island naturally, so they would never ever be here except for human introduction.
Right.
So Gran Canaria is 602 square miles or 1,559 square kilometers with a population of around 850,000. That seems pretty dense to me. I don't have
Hmm.
comparisons, but it does seem pretty dense.
Right. I mean, they're really beautiful islands, and as I understand, there's quite not a crazy habitation there, but there's definitely a lot of people that live there because they're just really. I've never been. It's definitely somewhere I wouldn't mind checking out, but it's just a really lovely climate, so it makes sense that it's dense.
Perfect for an invasive snake to establish.
Exactly.
So the topography and kind of the habitat that we're looking at within the Gran Canaria Island, this one specifically, Gran Canaria, is highly rural and mountainous on the interior, which is as you'd expect. And then, of course, beaches on the exterior. So you've got a very similar topographic, geologic, and probably floristic ecosystem or ecosystems that are conducive to having these invasive snakes establish. So, why or how was it introduced? We've talked about this a little bit, but I will get more in depth to it. California king snakes have a variety of morphs that make them attractive pets. Species collected for the pet trade were either accidentally or purposefully released on multiple occasions and have established breeding populations in multiple areas. This is probably a good time to break down a few things and explain a little bit more in detail the connections and disconnects between herpetology and reptile husbandry. I will also briefly explain selectively bred morphology in snakes in an attempt to illustrate the desire for certain animals and why this problem is a problem in the first place. So, first off, herpetology is a specific study of biology that focuses on reptiles and amphibians. Herpetology looks at the biology, ecology, anatomy, and many other metrics regarding herptiles in a scientific setting. Herptiles is just like an abbreviation for reptiles and amphibians. So if I reference that in the future, I'm referring to both reptiles and amphibians and all
Right.
their other little subsets, caecilians and tuataras and blah, 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 crocodilians. So anyway, reptile husbandry is the collection, keeping, and breeding of native or exotic animals for personal collections or in zoological settings. For the intents and purposes of this discussion, though, when I reference reptile husbandry, I will be specifically talking about private and personal collections. I will not be including licensed zoological facilities in this category because, in most situations, there is some conservation benefit for that aspect. And I'm talking about like approved zoological associations, not Joe Exotic's backyard and he has a bunch of snakes there.
If you fall for that, ladies and gentlemen, you're worse than a bunch of nuts in a squirrel tree.
Not that kind of zoological aspect. That would be considered a private collection as far as this conversation goes. So, within the reptile husbandry world, snakes are often bred because of ideal colors or patterns. Typically, the most prized are aberrant individuals that are unique amongst all other species in lack of patterning or difference in coloration as far as albinism or melanism and the other pigment variations go. There are also localities of individuals that may have unique patterning or particularly beautiful colorations that are collected and bred to increase quote unquote morph diversity. When we are talking about morphs in regards to husbandry and the pet trade, we are referring to genetic differences in the animals that are in regards to appearance. So the phenotypic traits. These can be bred to subsequent generations and, of course, sold for high price, making them very coveted. With artificially selective breeding, it is relatively common for certain morphs to have not only phenotypic differences, but genotypic differences as well, which are the ones that you can't necessarily see but are passed down from generation to generation. And these can lead to neurological or developmental defects. So essentially, certain morphological differences will be accompanied with a genetic defect.
Right. So for people like not thinking like snakes, reptiles, like a super common example I always use for this is like German shepherds that like always have hip issues because they were bred to have these like really beautiful like slanted backs, so then they have really bad hips. I think just a lot of people that aren't familiar with herp things might be able to relate more to that example.
Right, or a pug where it's been bred so much that it can't breathe very well anymore.
Right,
And
because
in
apparently the squished face is a wanted trait, but I don't know.
Right, yeah. And as far as like in the pet trade goes for reptiles and amphibians, I'm thinking of like spider ball python morphs that typically will have neurological issues, or perhaps kinked or defective snakes that just come because you're breeding out selective phenotypic traits and the genetic diversity and strength isn't necessarily there as if you were to be breeding the more prevalent normal morphs. So
Right.
because you're looking for these selectively bred traits, there tend to be a higher rate of genetic defects that accompany them. So
Right.
that's kind of, go ahead.
Sorry, that was me interrupting, right? It's a lot of inbreeding a lot of the times, right? Because if you have a perfect pair of snakes with your perfect traits, you inbreed those and then you're breeding the brothers and sisters or fathers, and that's when you lose your genetic diversity and you get problems with inbreeding too. So,
Right, exactly.
mhm.
So because this species of snake is readily available in the pet trade, easily kept in captivity, and has a variety of morphs that are regularly produced, they're not difficult to get a hold of. Many morphs are sold commercially in big name pet stores for anyone to buy without literally any experience. As you imagine, this can lead to problems when somebody buys a tiny snake that grows into a 122 centimeter or 4-foot snake and requires a lot more care than they originally intended. It's easy to just set the animal outside, where in most cases, if it's an exotic species, it's going to die because it's not going to be supported by that climate. Even more so, if you put an albino or a morph outside, it's almost surely going to die, unless, of course, you introduce it to an ecosystem where there are no native snakes and therefore no native snake predators. However, with a reptile as successful in range and habitat distribution as the California king snake, this can obviously lead to problems. So, interestingly, I've just discussed a lot about genetic diversity. So, one might think that the California king snake introduced populations might not fare so well because they're isolated populations and the genetic diversity is not necessarily there. And then inbreeding could cause a lot of genetic flaws and could potentially just harm the populations. Well, upon genetic analysis, it does appear as though there are clear differences in populations in regard to fitness. This suggests that introduction was not an isolated incident and has been done multiple times to allow for significant difference in genetic variability. The implications of this is that one population is actually more successful than another population in terms of reproduction, predation, and morphology. It also means that these snakes are so readily available in the pet trade and so frequently abandoned that they have been able to establish multiple populations on one small island. They've been released so many times, they have established genetically distinct populations on this island because of how readily available they are on an island off the coast of Africa. This is ridiculous.
Right. Well, so yeah, you're also getting like these distinct populations, and then you're getting a continuous influx of new genetic material, even if it's crappy genetic material, and that's just helping them do better. That's wild.
Right.
Mhm.
Yes. Yeah. It's pretty insane. So, okay. So, if we're discussing the distribution of the different patterns or aberrancies in the populations of snakes out at these different areas, if we're looking at the Telde Valesquillo areas, then we see that 29% of them are a striped pattern, which is essentially just a single stripe down the back. There's a 7% composition of banded albino patterns and a 3% composition of just typical banded patterns, which means that the banded patterns that you typically see are actually of the lowest density. And of course, I've left out the biggest percentage there if you're, following along and doing the math in your head. 61% of this population are striped albino, which means the overarching composition of this population is albino king snake. So it's not just like these king snakes are invasive and yeah, every so once in a while you find an albino one. At least in this specific population, overwhelmingly they are albino. Now, in the second area, Galdar, it's a little bit different. The distribution is different, which kind of lends to what we were talking about earlier as far as these being two separate populations and likely the establishing, original generation that was out there were different morphs and then, of course, different genetic variations as well. So at Galdar, 1% is the banded albino pattern, which is a complete flip from the 61% at the Tel de Valesquillo area. 3% are the striped albino pattern, 17% are the banded pattern, and 79% are the striped pattern, which is pretty still atypical and not what you would see when you're finding king snakes in their native habitat. So it's still a definite aberrancy there. But primarily, when I think people talk about these populations, they're definitely talking about Telde and Valesquillo, because that does seem to be the one where it's just overwhelmingly albino snakes, which is just, to me, insane to think about. What are the issues that are being caused by the introduction of these animals? Well, to understand the full impacts of the issues caused by this species, we need to discuss why the fact that this population being introduced on an island is so much more detrimental to native biodiversity than if it were to be introduced and established on a place that, let's say, wasn't an island. So we're going to talk a little bit about island ecology and how islands work very, very briefly, but this will set a precedent for why they're so destructive on this island. Islands are perhaps the most susceptible places to anthropogenic impacts. One of the most frequently cited causes for biological decline and collapse on islands is the introduction of invasive species. But why are islands so much more susceptible to human influences than other places? Well, their isolation from other ecosystems is a bit of a double-edged sword in the Anthropocene. Welcome to the Anthropocene. Islands function as isolated populations of animals that are often able to evolve without significant competition or predation. You can think of it this way. Islands function with extremely limited resources. For any native populations to be successful in the first place, they must function to operate under the limitations of resources available in that enclosed landmass. So you've got this little oasis of life that is essentially working, for lack of a better word, symbiotically with itself to preserve those resources within the finite landmass. Naturally, it's very unlikely that an introduced population of predators or competitors would just wash up or appear on the island. However, this is the Anthropocene podcast. Welcome to the Anthropocene. So we're going to do what humans are best at and make it about us. By introducing predators to these islands in an incredibly short time period, the native fauna is effectively defenseless against us. Not only are there direct effects from the predation of native individuals, but competition with native herpetofauna is also aiding in the decline of species and eventual biological collapse of this sensitive community. So essentially, we're looking at islands as these isolated areas that have to function in very, very small, confined resource available limitations. So if you've got a massive, massive continent, populations are free to expand past their native ranges and into other places. And especially with human influences, when you look at like coyote and deer and things like that, in the areas where there's not a lot of good habitat, they just expand to new ranges. So on an island, you can't do that. So the ecosystem there is significantly more sensitive to anthropomorphic influence than a massive landmass like a continent or something like that. And also, the ecosystem itself has evolved just to be more sensitive, because if it evolved one massive predator, then it would just collapse the ecosystem. So you've got islands as a very, very good example of how balance is key to establish these diverse ecosystems that don't necessarily negatively impact each other enough because of the system of checks and balances that has evolved over millions of years to cause a detriment to the ecosystems. However, humans don't operate within the confines of the typical nature limitations. So when we show up and we bring our development and our invasive species and things like that, the islands are defenseless against us.
The human world, it's a mess.
Right. Yeah. You've just had like everything that's evolved on an island has, in geological time, not in like human history, they've just had less evolutionary pressures, like you said, from different predators coming and going and different competitors coming and going when it's so much easier to move like that on a continent. So just kind of like having a little ecosystem in a bottle in a way, especially the more isolated the islands are, the more so I think that applies.
Right, that's actually a pretty good analogy. If you were to imagine a small terrarium in your room and you were to introduce one predator to that, one caterpillar that eats the plants you've got in there, it's going to decimate your little ecosystem because there's no place for those plants to spread out or, grow beyond the influence of this massive destructive doomsday caterpillar.
Right. And if you have your garden outside and there's a caterpillar or multiple caterpillars, it's likely that a bird or something is going to realize that there's the food there and come in and eat them.
Mr. Early Bird! How about the nice tasty worm on a stick?
But whereas on an isolated island, you just don't get that immigration or emigration that kind of makes that circle go around.
Right, especially when you introduce an organism that is just non-existent in that ecosystem in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem overall is really only exacerbated by the fact that these islands do not have any native snake species. That is to say, if a habitat has invasive snakes introduced, but it already has a population of native snakes present, there may be some overlap in predator avoidance for those potential prey items, as they're already accustomed to the presence of this type of predator. Gran Canaria, without any sort of predator that resembles a snake, is not going to be resistant to a snake. It's just not. There's nothing there. There's no predators on that island that exist that would give the animals any fear of that type of animal or awareness or defense against it.
Right. Would you say that it's naked and vulnerable?
Yeah, God damn it.
It's my turn today to make terrible puns.
Well, now I'm naked and afraid.
Oh, God.
So it's not just the direct impacts through predation that are affecting the islands. The native species that call the island home are being affected in one way or another by the presence of these snakes. It could be more direct impacts like food competition, or it could be more indirect niche related competition that derives from lack of certain animals on the island due to overpopulation. So essentially, you've got the snakes eating a certain population of birds or lizards or things like that because these snakes are somewhat opportunistic in what they eat. And those prey items in this case might play an important role in the ecosystem that the snakes are not necessarily directly affecting a different organism, but the lack of those prey items is now affecting a different organism. So there's both direct and indirect facts. Now, of course, the bird populations, the lizard populations, and things like that are all declining. A lot of the lizard populations now are listed as endangered, threatened, or critically endangered, even the ones that are like common on the island, just because there's obviously the competition. There's probably direct predation on these, and it's essentially collapsing this ecosystem in a multi-pronged attack. Sometimes we'll look at invasives that really only affect a certain aspect of an ecosystem. But in this case, with such an aggressive invasive introduced in such a confined area, it's really affecting the ecosystem as a whole. I mean, we are breaking down like the biological communities on pretty much every level at this point. So that is essentially what we're looking at as far as the direct effects and the indirect effects that come from the presence of these snakes. Essentially, when you introduce a predator to a relatively calm and fragile ecosystem that is heavily reliant on a checks and balances system to keep its equilibrium and stability, it can shake things up from a variety of different angles. All right, so now that we've covered essentially what the problem is and the subsequent problems that are being caused by this introduced species, we're going to take a short break. We're flying through this episode, and we want to make sure that we take our time and cover it as thoroughly as possible. As it is a bit of a newer kind of occurrence, and there's not a significant amount of concrete data done. Not to say that there aren't studies being done on this. There are many active studies being done. It's just that it does take years of research and impact analysis to understand the scope of certain things to get them published. So being that this is so new, we want to make sure that we cover it as thoroughly as we possibly can without drawing too many conclusions that are outside the realm of the published research. So we'll see you guys after the break.
Yeah, get yourself some refreshments and we'll be back.
Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
And welcome back.
That was creepy.
Guess it's just me.
I didn't like that.
Okay. Well, somebody likes it, I'm sure. I hope.
I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I'm leaving that in. So I hope you guys had a good break. I was actually told recently that by some people, and by some people, I mean my parents, that our podcast episodes are too long and boring. So maybe if this episode ends up being a little shorter, it's better. I don't know. I like to talk. So if we do longer episodes sometimes, my parents can suck it.
I did have a friend too that listened to one of the Anthroposnips and said, "Hey, I like that one. It was shorter."
Right.
I'm looking
Okay,
at you,
sorry, we're
Francisco.
getting off track
Thanks.
here. We'll get back on track. Sorry about that. But the podcasts are exactly as long as it takes us to get through the episode. That we don't have any time limit or anything like that. We have a rough, like, okay, I need to write this many pages to get it. But as you will see, sometimes it varies. And hey, so does science. So that's our cover story. So we're going to talk now about what is being done to manage these populations of introduced albino snakes. So populations were considered naturalized in 2007. Naturalized just essentially means that they are breeding and establishing their own populations there without aid of it.
What the hell was that?
Without aid, establishing their own populations there without additional aid of other introductions. Though obviously there are still probably introductions going on because the genetic diversity that exists within these populations. So between 2007 and 2011, which bear in mind is quite a long time ago at this point, over 1,000 snakes were caught and removed from the island. Some trapping methods were devised, but the most effective method of capture and removal proved to be the use of artificial cover, such as cover boards. For the non-herpers listening, being ectothermic, poikilothermic, or cold-blooded, as we used to call it, but we now know is not necessarily an accurate term to describe ectotherms, and poikilothermic is an even more specific way of describing certain ectotherms. We know that reptiles require external heat sources to maintain body temperatures. Therefore, something that uniformly heats up via radiant heat, like a flat piece of wood, rubber, or metal, can be very attractive to them. So the drawback being, of course, that these animals are free to leave at any time. So these trapping methods are good at attracting, but they don't necessarily keep them in there. However, the other traps, like cages and things like that, were not proving to be attractive enough to the snakes to bring them in. I use cover boards for my snake research, and essentially it's just a good place for them to live. It also draws in other little fossorial creatures like mice and things like that will nest under it, which just provides food for the animals, like the snakes and things. And then, of course, you've got the fact that it's able to heat them up. So you can confine your searches to times of day where you're more likely to find snakes under those cover boards. But of course, they have the ability to leave at any time. So it's not a trap in the same way that other traps would be. So to just be a little bit more specific about ectothermic versus endothermic, mammals are endothermic, which means we generate our own heat within our bodies. And ectothermic means that the heat has to come from outside. So essentially, if you were to put a blanket around a mammal, it would maintain its heat provided that the blanket is insulating enough to not allow heat to escape as it's generating it. If you were to put a blanket around a snake, it's not going to get any warmer. You're not helping it generate heat because that's how blankets work. If a snake is cold and you put a blanket over it, that's a cold snake in a blanket. That's not helping it at all. So,
I don't know why cold
um,
snake in a blanket is so cute to me.
I don't know. That was my nickname in high school, actually.
Cold snake in a blanket.
Yeah, I got out of the pool once and my shorts fell down.
It'd be funny if it weren't so pathetic. No, what the heck, I'll laugh anyway.
Oh, that's a long nickname though, regardless.
That's a total lie. I'm complete lying to you right now. There is current research being done regarding acetaminophen as a potential pesticide method for the control of king snakes on Gran Canaria. This method has been shown to be successful on Guam, where there are a large population of invasive brown tree snakes, and the same methods have been used to control these populations with pretty good success. So essentially how this works, because obviously we take acetaminophen for headaches and things like that, and it helps us out quite a bit.
Right.
But reptiles lack the enzymes necessary to process acetaminophen, and it essentially shuts down their liver in high quantities. So how are they doing this? Because you can't obviously just stick out a bunch of acetaminophen tablets and then sit with a glass of water and say, hey, if you got a headache, come over here, snakes. They prefer pop. Is that hold on, let me make that joke more appropriate. They prefer soda pop, because not everybody says pop.
No.
That's like a Midwest thing.
No. We say pop usually in Canada too. Like we don't say soda as much.
Cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a few friends who are fairly convinced that I'm just Canadian, but pretending to be American.
I mean, your secret is safe with me.
I'm not, and everybody listening, I'm not confirming nor denying that.
Ooh.
So basically, they're using small dead mice laced with acetaminophen, and they would be placed in areas with snake activity, so near or under these boards. This is a great example of why you should always get your dead mice uncut from a reputable dealer.
Hey kids, you want some dead mice?
You want some dead mice? It's totally clean. Being opportunistic feeders, a lot of people think that snakes are reliant on living prey or movement to attract to it. That's not necessarily true. King snakes in particular, and many colubrid snakes, are very good at scavenging dead things. I mean, you can literally just find, a snake eating like a week-old dead frog because it just happened to slither by. So they're just putting these mice under the cover boards and things like that to where they know the snakes are going to be at as a double-pronged attack, because if they go and look under the boards and there's a snake there, they grab it and they remove it. And if a snake goes under that board and they're not there, the acetaminophen could work as a pesticide. So any snakes that do come under those boards are going to die regardless, and it kind of omits that little possible error of not being in the right place at the right time to encounter these snakes.
Right.
These are not being implemented, or at least not to the point where it is considered the sole control method. It's in a testing phase, and I'm sure they're making sure it doesn't affect other biodiversity, which leads us right into the next part where we're going to talk about, are these control methods affecting native biodiversity? So obviously the snake boards are not necessarily causing any problems or anything like that. The only thing that a snake board is going to do is to block out light from the immediate area that it is in, and it will kill any plant life underneath. But the resulting soil and dirt compaction and things like that is beneficial to attracting the snakes, and it's not on a large enough scale to affect any sort of biodiversity as far as the floristic quality of the ecosystem goes.
Right.
So,
risk-benefit balance. Yeah.
Exactly. Of course, if you're poisoning mice with something like acetaminophen that can be lethal to reptiles, it's probably also worth noting that it can be toxic to both mammals and birds. Therefore, anything that eats these laced mice will likely die. However, that being said, being that there aren't many niche competitors for these invasive snakes, and mice are placed around places that will typically only attract snakes, there's a lot of mitigation that comes into play as far as non-target poisoning goes. Therefore, if there's any spillover into native species, it's probably more of a matter of we may kill a few native species by killing many invasive snakes, or we kill significantly less invasive snakes and they kill a much higher number of native species. Sort of a big picture situation.
Right. Well, and definitely like small birds of prey and stuff aren't going to be as prone to feed on dead mice and things like that. Like they're definitely more like live predators. This might be like bold of me to assume, but I'm also, or just wonder if these snakes too, a lot of them being released pets, like if they are also even like more prone to eat a dead mouse like they've been eating for their whole life that they're confined. I know a lot of these are generations and generations where they've been born
Right.
in the wild, but I wonder if there is almost like an inclination for them to eat like just as much dead mice as they would live ones, you know?
I mean, I just think that in general, because they're such a great captive snake and they typically eat dead mice, is the reason they're such good captive bred animals in
Right, right.
general.
So it's the
Because
reverse.
even
Like they're
for-
good captive animals because
Right.
they'll eat dead mice, not they eat dead mice because they're captive animals.
Right. Therefore, it
Right.
makes this a good method for their control.
Makes sense.
I just kind of want to get a little bit more specific about what I just said in that last part, just to be like
Mhm.
super clear about it
Mhm.
in regards to non-target poisoning and things like that. I did mention at the very beginning that the snakes don't exist on this island
Mhm.
and no similar predators exist on this island. Yes, there are lizards and things like that, but they're all very small. I mean, there are some that are called a giant lizard, but more or less, they're not occupying the same niche that this invasive snake has. There's probably a slight overlap, but for the most part, you're not getting a lot of additional occupation under these snake boards that isn't the snakes. So if you're putting the mice underneath them, if you were to put the mice out in the open and things like that, I feel like something might just come by and scavenge, like a lizard or something like that. But if you're putting them under these boards in areas that are already dominated by snakes and having adverse effects on the native ecosystems, then you're probably almost entirely killing just the snakes. And we can talk a little bit about the killing of snakes and things like that. But essentially, I'm just going to break it down to the most simplistic. Yes, we love snakes. Yes, I love snakes. I understand they're incredible creatures. They're awesome. And I'm sure many people get super, super frustrated when they see a highly prized collectible animal being euthanized because it's invasive. But it's a situation that humans have caused. And the most viable solution to mitigate as much environmental impact on the native ecosystem is going to be killing these animals or euthanizing them or removing them as quickly and efficiently as possible. So, yes, we cause the problem. We have to fix the problem. And the way to fix the problem is many times by euthanizing the invasive species. And it's not fair to the animals. It just isn't. But that is something that we have to deal with as ecologists or environmentalists or conservationists. I have personally had to put down invasive Burmese pythons and tegus from Florida, two animals that are absolutely gorgeous, stunningly beautiful, intelligent, and amazing animals and incredibly adaptable. And it sucks that because their adaptability has made them so successful here, we have to basically punish them for it for something that we caused in the first place. So instead of getting mad at the fact that people are currently killing these animals, what you should be getting mad at the fact is that we don't have preventative measures in place to stop invasive species establishment from happening in the first place. Because once it's happened, there's only so many options we can explore. But if we put more preventative measures in place, then it's things that we can do to prevent the killing of these animals that we love in the future. So sometimes you need to make sacrifices. And I think we're going to talk about that in the debate round, which will be following this. I know I said that we're not going to have a debate round, but I think in this situation, we're going to look at the viability of the pet trade and why you should or shouldn't keep exotic animals and how sometimes selfishness gets in the way of conservation and ecology. And we're going to take some pretty firm stances on what we think should happen as far as future conservation efforts and herpetological restrictions as far as the pet trade goes. So, without further ado, let's go to this weird kind of non-debate sort of debate round. And do you want me to start or do you want to start?
Let's get into it. Maybe you take the lead here, and I will follow along because I do definitely have opinions, but I want to see where you start us off here.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to talk about the pet trade in general, and I'm going to talk about it as somebody who is both an ecologist, conservationist, actively has removed invasive reptiles from native ecosystems, and also is a reptile keeper. Now, I keep reptiles for educational outreach. I keep native to the state I live in, or at least native to the US species, so that I can educate people and bring attention their adaptations, their unique structure or coloration or whatever is going to be appeasing to people from a situation that's in a controlled environment. There people couldn't normally see these animals in that manner. I mean, I can't just always go out and grab a snapping turtle out of a pond. I can try my best, but if I have one at home, or two in my case, then I can use them as educational animals, and it's beneficial for their conservation in the long run.
Right.
If something were to happen with these animals, however, like let's say worst case scenario, a tornado comes through here and just all the animals get out of their cage. Well, they're just going to be okay because I own animals that are native to this region and they're going to be fine. And any animals that I don't own native to this region would just die from the climatic differences and they wouldn't be able to establish. I also don't keep breeding populations, but that's a topic that we might discuss later. So,
Right.
to keep these animals, I have at least 2 permits. And there's a process that I need to. Illinois is pretty strict about the different processes you need to go to keep native animals and certain exotic animals. And I think that's for the best. People will a lot of times kind of talk down to Illinois for being so strict as far as what you can and cannot keep. But I think that the stricter the laws, the better it's going to be for conservation efforts. Because if you are willing to go through all of those steps and hoops that you have to jump through to obtain these animals, then it shows that your dedication is there and you're at least willing to do the research on what is needed for their conservation. So some places will have to take a class. If you have to keep venomous snakes in Illinois, you need 150 hours of training behind a venomous snake, a licensed venomous snake handler, and a $100,000 insurance policy for each animal. So
Wow.
that
Okay.
obviously keeps your standard. I want a big venomous snake. Maybe I shouldn't do a southern accent, but I'm gonna. And I want a big snake, or I want a venomous snake, and in Illinois, snakes over a certain length are considered deadly and things like that because they could have negative effects on people. And in my opinion, the more limitations on the pet trade, the better, not only for the introduction of these species that could potentially be invasive, but also the fact that many of these species are wild caught because, again, we talked about genetic differences and things like that. You can't just keep breeding the same genetics. If there's a species that's super hyper coveted, you better believe that it's being poached significantly from its native habitat. And anybody who disagrees with that or says that it's just for the betterment of genetic diversity and stuff like that is just bullshitting. And I think they're completely full of shit. That's my personal opinion. Anybody who claims that they're collecting to diversify genetics for conservation in their garage snake breeding thing that they've established, it's not true, because you can't breed snakes and then re-release them unless you're a zoological facility that has the proper licensing and permits to do so. Because if you're breeding populations in a sterile and enclosed environment, those populations are not going to be able to be reintroduced to the wild. So that's just something that I think is a bit of a dumb argument in regards to one that I hear frequently from the pet trade. And I'm not here to crap on the pet trade. Like, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just saying that it needs to be done responsibly. If you truly love these animals and care about their conservation, then you can't just care about certain animals. You have to care about all of them. So yeah, you love snakes, so you love California king snakes, so you release them into the wild or something. but you don't love the lizards that they're extirpating from their native areas. Or in Florida, I met somebody who said that they released iguanas, chameleons, night anoles, all these invasive species down there so that he could have his own private little collection area behind his house. Now, if you try to tell me that that's for conservation or genetic diversity, then you don't know what you're talking about. That's just somebody being selfish and trying to make a profit off of these animals. There is a
Right.
massive demand for unique morphs, crazy, exotic animals and things like that. And yes, there are collectors that genuinely just appreciate these animals, but the people selling these animals in bulk and things like that, they're selling them for the money. They're
Right.
not selling
Well,
them because they love these animals. And if they do love these animals, then you would think they would do enough research to keep them in naturalistic setups that would at least encourage some natural behaviors and things like that, and not in sterile bins with a paper towel and a water bowl. Because if you're just meeting the bare minimum essentials of dietary needs for an animal, in my opinion, you're not meeting the actual necessities of enrichment and habitat mimicry that encourages natural behaviors in a healthy, long-lived animal.
right. Well, and I mean, do stop me if I'm wrong, but of course you need genetic diversity and you need mixing in your populations and things like that. But is there not a way to connect between breeders, like especially in the United States? In some other places it might be more difficult, but you can that's why you sell, between breeders or set up breeding programs like between different organisms and get your genetic diversity from other captive animals, right?
Right.
But that's
And
expensive and difficult and requires a lot of work as opposed to wild animals that are caught. So that
right. And like we discussed in the salamander snip, you've got a better immune system and generally growth rate from wild caught individuals. You can breed snakes and have a bunch of little tiny babies that you can't sell for a year or two, or you can go steal one from, some protected habitat and have a big 4-foot snake and then sell that for a few $100s.
right.
If you're a poacher, fuck you. You're doing nothing to the betterment of conservation and you're just being selfish. So I know plenty of people who are, scientists, biologists, and things like that who keep reptiles. They keep exotic reptiles too and stuff like that. They go through all of the processes. They source from captive bred individuals. They're not buying wild caught individuals. The higher demand we have for wild caught individuals is going to cause the decline of these species in the wild significantly faster. Now, I'm not saying wild caught individuals can't be done in a responsible manner. What I am saying, though, is that if you're buying an animal, the demand can't be for every individual consumer,
Mhm.
because I want this animal, but it's not bred well in captivity or something like that, or it doesn't it's new to the pet trade, so there's not populations, or captive bred individuals are difficult to breed, so they cost way more. So I'm just gonna save my money and time because I want it now and buy a wild caught individual, and then explain to my social media following why it was okay because of X, Y, and Z, when in reality, it's just somebody being selfish and impatient and wanting something right now. I would love to have a big-headed turtle. Can't remember the species epithet, but the Madagascar big-headed turtle is an amazing turtle. Or a dragon snake, the like Xeno, I can't remember the
That's okay.
is for that one, but it's like the dragon snake or whatever, or an earless monitor. These are just three relatively new introductions to the pet trade. I think they're also relatively newly described species, and none of them breed well in captivity, if at all. And there's a huge demand for them because they look super cool and they're unique. And it's just a greed thing in this point where they're being poached from their habitat, where they are pretty much all endangered or at least species of special concern. And guys, it's not that hard to think. And I'm not talking to the people listening to this podcast because I think that most of them are conservationists, and that you understand that there needs to be balances in the pet trade system. But this goes without saying. Most conservation efforts need to be more strict. And there is going to be a lack of convenience, and it's going to be more difficult to obtain certain animals and things like that. But that's good, because eventually we're going to just exhaust all of the wild populations, and it's not there's going to be nothing. So
Yeah. So for me, playing on the devil's advocate side as well, I don't personally keep reptiles. I think I maybe, could be interested in it at some time, but why do you really need, like, of course you want one of these animals because they're so cool, but like, do you really need it in a big cage in your house when there's other ways to go and enjoy it in nature, or go on a trip and see it, or appreciate it through other things? Like, I understand why people want these kind of pets, but it's just this weird, like, anthropocentric thing that we have around wanting to keep wild things as pets. Personally, I don't think it's necessary for the majority of different organisms. That's my kind of devil's advocate, that it's just us being selfish that we want these animals in our homes, but we should just be able to appreciate them where they are.
Yeah, and sometimes you can't appreciate every animal on the planet, and that's something that people need to come to terms with. Is like, I don't think a lot of people like saying like, "Oh, I'll never see that in my lifetime," because, it's like, "Oh, I don't have that possible dream or whatever." Who cares? You can find anywhere in the world some of the coolest reptiles and amphibians and animals in general everywhere you go within a short distance. However, if we keep up our poaching and our demand on wild caught individuals and things like that, that will not be the case forever. We are
Right.
exhausting our native species population, and the more they're collected, the less they're going to be successful in the wild. And eventually, there's going to be no pet trade at all because there's going to be no pets. Now, there was recently a law that was introduced in Florida, and it banned the selling, collection, or keeping, or whatever, of tegus, Burmese pythons, and other listed species and things like that. And it caused an absolute uproar among the reptile husbandry. People were saying, my rights are being violated. I can own whatever I want. This is stupid. They just want to do it because they hate me. No, I'm not saying the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission is the best or most upstanding place in the world, or that every, DNR or environmental protection agency or anything like that is like not interested in some ulterior motives. However, it was designed by conservationists for the purpose of conservation. Now, if you think that your right to own a tegu is more important than the fact that these invasive tegus are decimating endangered wild bird and crocodilian populations in Florida, then that's just you being selfish. That is not infringing on your rights. That is you saying that my rights are more important than the rights of this entire ecosystem. I completely understand that if you love tegus and things like that, you're upset that you can't keep them anymore. They're not taking your animals. I've heard people say that they're going to come and take my animal. No, you are allowed to keep whatever animals you have in your current collection. You cannot breed anymore or get additional animals. If you love them that much, I understand. They're completely endearing. That's why they're popular in the pet trade. That's why they've been released and escaped and have established populations. They're really cool animals. I've worked with them. I know. I understand. But I also understand firsthand the detriments that they are doing. Sometimes when they're looking at the stable isotopic analysis of these tegus and things like that, they're seeing that the predominant things they're eating are like crocodile and nesting bird eggs, endangered species. So you're saying that these endangered species are less important than your right to own an invasive species. And I think, and this is going to not be popular in the reptile husbandry area, but I think each state should be evaluating which species could potentially be invasive and established, and restricting the importation, sale, and ownership of those species to protect the ecosystems. We are doing plenty of things and introducing plenty of invasive plants as it is to these ecosystems that are in each of our own native backyards. We don't need to add faunal invasives as well, because those are arguably more aggressive because they're actively moving and breeding and things like that, whereas plants are stationary. Now, obviously, you can make an argument for both.
Yeah.
They're both bad, but we don't need to exacerbate the problem by adding invasive species. Yes, maybe you can't own a tegu in Florida or something like that, but you can own animals that they couldn't own somewhere else. maybe up north
Right.
where it's colder.
And something I want to add is it's unfortunate because I do know lots of like super responsible pet owners of reptiles, of different things, but it's always, the few people that have to ruin it for everybody else. It's the people that haven't done their research. Like we mentioned earlier, the snake gets too big, they don't have the food for it, they release it afterwards. There's some weird cases of people you're saying like intentionally release for like breeding purposes, but I think the biggest issue is around people are like, oh my god, this turtle is 5 times bigger than it was before, and I'm just gonna slip
Right.
it into this pond. Even with goldfish and things like that. And
Right.
it's unfortunate. It really is. I have a really good friend that has an exotic snake in Canada. I know for sure that he gives it proper enrichment, that it has a great little life. But I'm sorry, guys, this is why we can't have nice things.
This is why we can't have nice things, Barry. You asshole!
It's because people don't do their research. So I'm super glad to hear states like that where it says, hey, take a 100-hour course or whatever. Because if you really want that animal and you're going to take great care of it, I would be super down for everybody having whatever kind of pet that they want to have. But it's just people suck at the end of the day, and they just don't take the proper care of it. So do your research. Even something as simple as a hamster. Like people think that it's less work than it is. If you're gonna have a pet, like be responsible about your pets, and that's. I mean, we could go on and on about this all day, but I'll let you add some final notes, and I think we can kind of wrap it up, and maybe we can do a live about this or something someday if people want to chime in, and we can talk about what they think about those different things. Maybe get mad at us, maybe agree with us, but yeah, anything else?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to wrap up that, again, I'm not attacking anybody who wants to own or does own exotic pets, and we're not calling you dumb. We're not saying that everybody who owns exotic pets is dumb. We're saying that there are a few people that spoil it, but also if you keep exotic animals anywhere where they could become invasive, you might not intentionally release them, but escape pets are one of the reasons that the Burmese pythons established in the first place in Florida. And that's just one example. Weather events or anything, break-ins, accidental releases are more common than you may think. And it's not necessarily that it's people intentionally introducing them all the time, but there is, of course, the added effects of accidental introductions, which are just as detrimental. It doesn't matter the intention or lack of intention behind the introduction. What matters is that you understand that you can't keep something because whether or not you intend to release it, if it gets out, it could become devastating to those ecosystems. And I would love to hear feedback from all of you. We took this episode a little bit in a different route, and I'm sure we're going to circle back here in other episodes because eventually we will cover invasive Burmese pythons and tegus in all of Florida. I think I'm planning on doing just a Florida episode and just making
Maybe
it a
in
super
2
long
parts.
one. Yeah, it's going to be a 2-parter for sure. We're waiting. Maybe that'll be one of the season finales or something like that. But we would love to hear your feedback. Also, with the anthroposnips and things like that, I was also considering potentially having people submit comments and questions or things that they specifically want us to address, because we obviously have a long list of things to get through for the main episodes. But if you want us to address a specific topic, an anthropomorphic or anthropocentric topic that you either know about, want to know more about, or want to see us cover, absolutely provide us with that. And I think that might even be a pretty good medium for the anthroposnips, because as it stands, it's just us looking up current information and we're not necessarily addressing a certain topic. I would enjoy answering some questions or some topics set out by you guys. And if you maybe donate to us at a higher level, we would definitely do your suggestion.
Right. I think that's a good place to wrap up. I know we could talk all day about pet trade and different things like that, but I learned a lot from the king snake today, so that was super interesting. And we will see you all next time for an anthroposnip again.
Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover.